The border between America and Canada is supposed to represent law, order, and international cooperation. But for over 70 years, that border meant something entirely different to one criminal organization. The Buffalo crime family treated the international boundary like it was just another street corner in their neighborhood, moving men, money, and merchandise back and forth as if customs agents didn't exist. From their base in Buffalo, New York, they reached into Ontario and turned Hamilton into a mafia city as thoroughly controlled as any territory in Sicily itself. This is the story of that empire, the men who built it, and the blood that still stains both sides of the border. The story begins not in Buffalo, but in a small Sicilian town called Castellammare del Golfo, perched on the northwestern coast of Sicily, where the Mediterranean Sea crashes against ancient stone. This town, whose name means castle on the Gulf of the Sea, produced more mafia bosses than any other place on earth. In the early 1900s, young men from this town carried their traditions, their honor codes, and their capacity for violence across the Atlantic Ocean to America, seeking fortune in a new world, but never forgetting the old one. Among these men were two brothers who would change the face of organized crime in North America, Stefano and Pietro Magaddino. Stefano Magaddino was born on October 10, 1891, in Castellammare del Golfo, and organized crime ran through his blood like inheritance. Both of his grandfathers had been leaders of separate factions of the Sicilian Mafia, men of respect who settled disputes and controlled territories through a combination of fear and tradition. Young Stefano learned early that power in Sicily came not from the government or the police, but from men who understood that respect was earned through strength, and that loyalty was the only currency that truly mattered. In 1902, seeking the opportunities that America promised, Magaddino made the long journey across the ocean and arrived in New York City, joining thousands of other Italian immigrants who crowded into tenements on the Lower East Side. New York in the early 20th century was a chaotic mixture of opportunity and desperation. Italian immigrants worked brutal hours in factories, dug tunnels for the subway system, and loaded cargo on the docks. But some men saw another path to success, one that didn't require breaking your back for pennies. The Italian neighborhoods of New York already had criminal organizations, groups of men from the same Sicilian towns who banded together for protection and profit. Stefano Magaddino joined the Castellammare's clan in Brooklyn, a group made up entirely of men from his hometown. The clan was powerful, respected, and connected to the old country in ways that made them different from other criminal groups. They weren't just thieves or street thugs. They were men of honor who followed the ancient codes of omertà and rispetto, silence and respect. For nearly 2 decades, Magaddino worked his way up through the Brooklyn underworld, learning the American side of the criminal business while maintaining connections to Sicily. He was smart, careful, and ruthless when necessary. But in 1921, everything changed in a moment of violence that would alter the course of mafia history on 2 sides of the international border. Pietro Magaddino, Stefano's younger brother, was murdered by a man named Camillo Caizzo in a dispute over territory and respect. The rules of the Sicilian Mafia were clear and absolute. Blood demanded blood, and a brother's murder could not go unavenged. Stefano Magaddino hunted down Camillo Caizzo and killed him in Avon, New Jersey, satisfying honor but creating a serious problem. The police identified Magaddino as the killer, and murder charges were filed. Facing life in prison or execution, Stefano did what many hunted men did. He ran. But Magaddino didn't run far, and he certainly didn't hide. Instead, he went to Buffalo, New York, a city that would become his fortress for the next 5 decades. Buffalo in 1921 was a thriving industrial city, home to massive steel mills, grain elevators that were the tallest buildings in the world, and a sprawling port that connected the Great Lakes to the eastern seaboard. The city had a large Italian population, many from Sicily, and it already had a small but growing mafia presence. Angelo Palmieri had emerged as Buffalo's first mafia boss in the early 1900s, and by 1912, he had stepped down to become underboss, allowing Joseph DiCarlo to take control of the family. When DiCarlo died in 1922, just a year after Magaddino arrived in Buffalo, the timing was perfect. Stefano Magaddino, bringing with him the prestige of the Castellamarese clan and the reputation of a man who honored blood debts, quickly rose to power and became the new boss of the Buffalo crime family. Magaddino understood something that many other mafia bosses didn't fully grasp. Geography was destiny. Buffalo sat at one of the most strategic locations in North America, right on the international border with Canada. The Niagara River separated Buffalo from Fort Erie, Ontario, and the Peace Bridge connected the two cities. Just a few miles away, Niagara Falls attracted millions of tourists every year. To the north, less than an hour's drive, lay Hamilton, Ontario, a gritty industrial city with steel mills, factories, and a growing Italian immigrant population. Magaddino looked at that border and saw not a barrier but an opportunity. A chance to build something no other American mafia family had ever accomplished, a truly international criminal empire. The timing could not have been better. In 1920, the United States had done something spectacularly foolish. It banned alcohol. Prohibition made it illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport alcoholic beverages, and overnight, America's criminals became the nation's bartenders. Canada, however, had no such laws, at least not ones that were enforced with any seriousness. Canadian distilleries could legally produce whiskey, and Canadian citizens could legally purchase it. The only illegal part was bringing it across the border into the United States, but that was a technicality that creative men could work around. Stefano Magaddino saw the Canadian border as the greatest business opportunity of his lifetime, and he built his empire on moving liquor from the legal side of the Niagara River to the thirsty side. The bootlegging operation was simple in concept, but required organization and connections. Canadian distilleries produced high-quality whiskey, and Canadian suppliers were happy to sell to anyone with cash. The challenge was moving thousands of cases across the border without the police or customs agents interfering. Magaddino used every trick available. Boats crossed the Niagara River and Lake Erie at night, their running lights off, navigating by moonlight to small docks on the American side. Trucks with hidden compartments drove across the Peace Bridge or through remote border crossings where guards could be bribed. Some liquor was even transported through tunnels dug under the border, emerging in Buffalo basements. The operation required men on both sides of the border, suppliers, drivers, guards, and enforcers. Magaddino didn't just move liquor through Canada, he established a permanent presence there, placing trusted men in Ontario to manage the Canadian side of the business. The money that poured in during Prohibition was staggering. Americans were willing to pay almost any price for quality alcohol, and Magaddino's organization delivered. He reinvested the profits into legitimate businesses, funeral homes, hotels, restaurants, and taxi companies. The funeral home was particularly useful because it gave Magaddino a legitimate reason to be in the business of transporting things in coffins, and nobody wanted to look too closely at what might be hidden beneath the satin lining. By the late 1920s, the Buffalo crime family had become wealthy beyond anything the early Sicilian immigrants could have imagined, and Stefano Magaddino had become one of the most powerful mafia bosses in America. In 1931, everything changed again, but this time in a way that cemented Magaddino's power permanently. The American Mafia had been at war with itself, a brutal conflict called the Castellamarese War that pitted old guard Sicilian bosses against younger, more Americanized gangsters who wanted to modernize organized crime. When the war ended, the survivors created something new, the Commission, a governing body that would settle disputes between families, divide territories, and prevent future wars that brought too much police attention. The commission was made up of the bosses of the most powerful mafia families in America, and Stefano Magaddino was one of the original members. He sat at that table alongside legendary figures like Lucky Luciano, Joe Bonanno, and others who would become infamous in the history of organized crime. The commission meeting that concerned Canada was particularly important for Magadino's future. The bosses recognized that Canada was too valuable to fight over, so they divided it like European powers had once divided Africa. The decision was made in 1931. Stefano Magadino and his Buffalo family would control Ontario, Canada, and his nephew Joseph Bonanno and the Bonanno family would control Quebec, Canada. This wasn't just a suggestion or a guideline. It was Mafia law backed by the full authority of the Commission. Any other American family that wanted to operate in Ontario had to get permission from Magadino first, and he rarely gave it. Ontario, particularly the industrial cities around the western end of Lake Ontario, became Buffalo's territory as surely as if Magadino had been appointed governor. Hamilton. Ontario became the crown jewel of Magadino's Canadian Empire. Located about 40 miles from Buffalo across the border, Hamilton was an industrial powerhouse, home to massive steel mills that lit up the night sky with the glow of blast furnaces. The city attracted Italian immigrants who came to work in the mills, and among those immigrants were men from Calabria and Sicily who understood the old ways. One of these men was Giacomo Lupino, who arrived in Hamilton in the 1950s and established what would become the Lupino crime family. But the Lupino family was never independent. From the very beginning, it was understood that they operated under Buffalo's authority, essentially serving as Magadino's Canadian crew. The relationship between the Buffalo family and their Canadian operations was based on blood, marriage, and mutual profit. Giacomo Lupino married into Sicilian families with connections that stretched back to the Old Country, and his daughter would later marry Paolo Violi, creating family ties that bound the organizations together. Another Hamilton family, the Papalias, also operated under Buffalo's umbrella, and a third organization, the Musitanos, completed the trio of Mafia families that controlled organized crime in Hamilton. These families worked together more often than they fought, sharing the enormous profits from gambling, loan sharking, drug trafficking, labor racketeering, and every other criminal enterprise that thrived in an industrial city where money flowed and law enforcement was often overwhelmed or corrupt. The Commission's decision to give Magadino control over Ontario created something unique in Mafia history. While other families might have connections in foreign countries, the Buffalo family actually controlled entire Canadian cities as if they were part of their territory. Buffalo's made members could move freely in Hamilton, conducting business, collecting debts, and enforcing discipline without asking permission from anyone except their own bosses. Canadian criminals who wanted to operate in Hamilton had to pay tribute to the Buffalo family or face violent consequences. The border meant nothing to Magadino's organization. They treated Ontario as naturally as they treated Niagara Falls or Lackawanna, suburbs of their empire rather than foreign territory. Magadino himself became a figure of mystery and power. He lived modestly compared to some Mafia bosses, avoiding flashy displays of wealth that attracted attention. He operated out of funeral homes, maintaining a legitimate business while conducting his criminal affairs in back rooms and during long drives with trusted associates. He was careful about surveillance, paranoid about informants, and absolutely ruthless with anyone who betrayed the organization. Stories spread about his intelligence network, his ability to know what was happening in cities hundreds of miles away, and his willingness to wait years to settle a grudge. He married and had children, presenting himself to the Buffalo community as a respectable businessman and family man, while controlling an empire built on bootlegging, gambling, and violence. The 1950s and early 1960s represented the peak of Magadino's power. He was the longest-serving member of the Commission and one of the most respected bosses in the American Mafia. His territory stretched from western New York through Pennsylvania and deep into Ontario. He had made men in Buffalo, Niagara Falls, Rochester, and Hamilton, all sworn to obey his commands and maintain omerta, the code of silence that protected the organization from law enforcement. The Buffalo family was relatively small compared to the New York families, with perhaps 40 to 50 made members, but they controlled their territory completely and avoided the internal wars that plagued other organizations. Money poured in from numerous sources: illegal gambling operations in Buffalo and Hamilton, loan sharking that preyed on desperate workers, labor racketeering that controlled unions in the construction and trucking industries, and increasingly, narcotics trafficking that would become the most profitable criminal enterprise of the modern era. But empires built on sand eventually sink, and the foundation of Magadino's power had cracks that would widen into chasms. The first major blow came in 1957, and it happened because of Magadino's arrogance and a fundamental miscalculation about how the modern world worked. The commission decided to hold a meeting at the home of Joseph Barbara in Appalachian, New York, a small town in the southern tier region of the state. Dozens of mafia bosses and underbosses traveled to this remote location, arriving in expensive cars and wearing tailored suits. Magadino believed that Appalachian's isolation would protect the meeting from law enforcement attention, but he was wrong. The arrival of multiple limousines in a tiny hamlet caught the attention of the New York State Police, who raided the meeting and arrested numerous mafia figures. Magadino himself escaped by fleeing through the muddy woods in his expensive suit, but many others were caught, including John C. Montana, a respected Buffalo businessman whose arrest destroyed his public reputation. The Appalachian raid was a disaster for organized crime because it proved to the American public and law enforcement that the Mafia existed as a national organization, something the FBI had previously denied. Following Appalachian, the FBI made destroying the Mafia a top priority. J. Edgar Hoover, who had spent years insisting that organized crime didn't exist, now threw the Bureau's resources into infiltrating and prosecuting Mafia families. Buffalo became a target, and Stefano Magadino, once untouchable, found himself under constant surveillance. FBI agents followed his associates, tapped phones, planted informants, and built cases that would eventually bring down major figures in the organization. In 1967, almost exactly 10 years after Appalachian, history repeated itself in an event that became known as Little Appalachian. FBI agents raided an illegal gambling hall in the basement of Panaro's Snowball Lounge in Buffalo and arrested almost every member of the Magadino crime family except Stefano and his son. The arrests were a humiliation and a warning. The FBI was watching everything, and the era of operating with impunity was ending. The same year brought another devastating blow to Magadino's organization when Pasquale "Patty" Calabresi, a low-level thug arrested for burglaries, made a decision that would accelerate the family's decline. The Magadino bosses, dealing with their own problems, ignored Calabresi's situation and offered no help with his legal troubles. Feeling abandoned, Calabresi did what was once unthinkable. He became an informant. He told police that he committed robberies on the orders of underboss Federico the Wolf Randaccio and Capo Pat Natarelli. On December 11, 1967, both men were convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison, removing two key figures from the organization's leadership. The message was clear: loyalty no longer flowed just one way, and men who felt disrespected would break omertà to save themselves. But the truly catastrophic moment came in 1968, when Magadino's empire began to crumble from within because of his own greed and stupidity. By this time, Magadino had been telling his underlings that money was tight and he couldn't afford to pay them Christmas bonuses. The men grumbled, but accepted this explanation because questioning the boss could be fatal. Then police raided Magadino's funeral home and his son's attic and found $500,000 in cash stashed away. $500,000 in 1968 would be worth several million dollars today, and Magadino had hidden it while claiming poverty to the men who risked their freedom and lives for the organization. The discovery destroyed trust within the family. Men began to question whether Magadino was hoarding other money, whether he had been cheating them for years, whether the boss who demanded absolute loyalty had been betraying them all along. The internal suspicion and anger intensified when associates of the Buffalo family orchestrated a spectacularly foolish burglary that brought even more FBI attention. Under Magadino's oversight, thieves broke into the home of T. Edward Hanley, a wealthy art collector, and stole 14 paintings and 2 statues, worth over $1 million. The burglary happened while Hanley slept in his own bed, and when he woke to discover the theft, his eccentric and determined wife began a crusade to recover the art that would make life miserable for the Buffalo Mafia. The FBI, already investigating the family, saw the art theft as an opportunity to build more cases against Magadino's organization. Associates were arrested, charged, and offered deals to testify. The art theft, intended to raise quick cash, instead became another nail in the empire's coffin. Magadino's health began to fail as his empire crumbled around him. The stress of FBI investigations, internal betrayals, and the loss of key leaders took its toll on a man who had once seemed invincible. By the early 1970s, he was in his 80s, an old man trying to hold together an organization that was fracturing along generational and factional lines. Younger members wanted to modernize, to embrace the massive profits available from drug trafficking, while older members feared that narcotics would bring too much law enforcement heat. Rival factions within the family began positioning themselves for the inevitable transition of power. The unity that had characterized the Buffalo family under Magadino's leadership evaporated, replaced by suspicion and maneuvering. On July 19, 1974, Stefano Magadino died of natural causes at the age of 82, ending an era. He had been boss of the Buffalo crime family for 52 years, longer than almost any other American mafia boss in history. He had built an empire that controlled territory on both sides of the international border, maintained his position on the commission, and survived numerous challenges from law enforcement and rivals. But the organization he left behind was a shadow of what it had been at its peak. The family descended into internal warfare as factions fought for control, with no clear leader strong enough to unite everyone under a single authority. The fighting continued through the mid-1970s until a new boss emerged who would try to rebuild what Magadino had created, Joseph Todaro Sr. Joseph Todaro Sr. took control of the Buffalo family in the early 1980s. And he faced the challenging task of rebuilding an organization that had been torn apart by internal wars and FBI prosecutions. Todaro was different from Magadino in important ways. He was more low-key, avoiding the public attention that had brought down so many mafia figures. He focused on maintaining the family's core businesses, particularly labor racketeering through the Laborers International Union of North America, Local 210, where Buffalo family members had been operating for years. The union position gave them legitimate cover while allowing them to continue loan sharking, bookmaking, and other criminal enterprises. Todaro was cautious, patient, and smart enough to adapt to the new realities of law enforcement pressure and informant culture. Under Todaro's leadership, the Buffalo family maintained its connection to Canada, particularly to Hamilton, though the relationship had evolved. By the 1980s and 1990s, a new generation had taken over in Hamilton. Paolo Violi, who had been a powerful figure in Montreal before being murdered by the Rizzuto crime family in 1978, left behind 2 sons who would reshape the Canadian side of the Buffalo Empire, Domenico and Giuseppe Violi. The brothers had grown up in Hamilton after their father's murder, raised by their mother in the protection of the Lupino family, which was connected to them through marriage. The Violi brothers learned the family business, but were smarter and more careful than many of their predecessors, understanding that success in the modern era required avoiding attention while maximizing profits. In 1989, the FBI identified Joseph Todaro Sr. and his son, Joseph Todaro Jr., as the leaders of a 45-member Buffalo Mafia family that controlled various criminal activities, including labor racketeering, bookmaking, loan sharking, and narcotics trafficking. The investigation claimed that Todaro Jr. was running the family on behalf of his semi-retired father, who split time between homes in Tonawanda, New York, and Florida. The investigation also identified Leonard F. Falzone as controlling a loan sharking operation for the Todaros and brothers Victor and Daniel Sansonese as running a bookmaking operation. The FBI even planted a recording device in Falzone's union-owned car, though it failed to provide usable evidence linking the Totoros to illegal gambling. Despite the investigation, the Totoros avoided prosecution, demonstrating the same careful approach that had allowed them to maintain control for decades. The most remarkable development in the Buffalo family's Canadian operations came in the 21st century, when the Violi brothers' connection to Buffalo strengthened to an unprecedented degree. Giuseppe Violi was convicted in 1996 for conspiracy to smuggle cocaine and served 7 years in prison. After his release, he returned to the family business with his brother Domenico, who had become a made member of the Buffalo family in January 2015. The brothers were ambitious, intelligent, and connected to multiple criminal organizations through family ties and business relationships. They operated in Hamilton but maintained close contact with Buffalo, traveling back and forth across the border regularly for meetings and to conduct business. In November 2017, Canadian law enforcement struck a massive blow against the Violi brothers and their organization. A multi-city bust involving the RCMP and local police forces resulted in the brothers being charged with 75 offenses, including conspiracy to import controlled substances, possession for the purpose of trafficking contraband tobacco, trafficking firearms, and participating in a criminal organization. 9 people in total were arrested, and during the raids, police seized large quantities of fentanyl, carfentanil, heroin, cocaine, over 250,000 tablets of controlled substances, 3 million cigarettes, and several gaming machines. The scale of the operation was staggering, revealing that the Buffalo family's Canadian crew had become major players in the deadly opioid trade that was killing thousands of people across North America. But the wiretaps from the Violi's brothers' case revealed something even more significant than the drug trafficking operation. The intercepted conversations showed that in October 2017, at a meeting in Florida, Joseph Todaro Jr., the boss of the Buffalo crime family, promoted Domenico Violi to underboss, making him the second highest-ranking member of the organization. This was extraordinary for 2 reasons. First, Violi was the first Canadian to hold the underboss position in an American Mafia family, breaking a tradition that had existed for decades. Second, the promotion was so unusual that Todaro consulted with the Commission for permission, indicating that the decision had to be approved by the governing body of the American Mafia. The wiretaps recorded Violi boasting that he had beaten out 30 other people for the position, confirming that the Buffalo family had at least 30 made members, including Canadian members such as Violi's uncles Natale and Rocco Lupino. The promotion of Domenico Violi to underboss represented the culmination of nearly a century of Buffalo's control over Canadian territory. What Stefano Magaddino had started in the 1920s by establishing connections across the border had evolved into something more integrated than anyone could have imagined. The Buffalo family didn't just influence or cooperate with Canadian criminals. They had fully absorbed them into the organization's structure, promoting them to positions of high authority and treating the border as completely irrelevant. The Lupino crime family, once described as independent, was now understood to be Buffalo's Canadian crew, operating under direct control from across the border. Court documents filed by the RCMP in spring 2019 confirmed this connection, officially recognizing what law enforcement had suspected. For years, the Buffalo Mafia controlled significant criminal operations in Hamilton and other Ontario cities. The story of Giuseppe. Violi's recorded conversations with an undercover agent revealed the changing attitudes within Mafia organizations in the modern era. In February 2015, Giuseppe told the agent that his nephew Seishi had been approached about becoming a made member, but declined, telling his father that he believed there was not enough money to be made and that there were too many headaches involved. This rejection would have been unthinkable in Stefano Magaddino's time, when becoming a made member was the highest honor a criminal could achieve. But in the 21st century, young men with criminal ambitions could see that the Mafia life offered less than it once did. The intense law enforcement scrutiny, the mandatory prison sentences, the constant risk of informants, and the reality that modern criminals could make more money in drug trafficking without the restrictions of traditional organized crime made membership less appealing. The old ways were dying, killed not by heroic law enforcement, but by simple economics and the calculations of a new generation that valued profit over tradition. In August 2024, the violence that had always lurked beneath the surface of Hamilton's Mafia scene exploded again. Sources in Canadian law enforcement identified unnamed members of Buffalo Mafia's Hamilton branch as the main suspects in the murders of the Musitano brothers, Angelo and Pasquale, who had been killed in separate incidents years earlier. The investigation suggested that old feuds from the 1990s and early 2000s, when various Hamilton families had fought for control of territory and criminal enterprises, had reignited. The RCMP and Ontario Police were examining whether the Buffalo family had sanctioned the killings or whether they represented unauthorized violence that violated Mafia rules. Either way, the murders demonstrated that even in the modern era, with its sophisticated surveillance and harsh prison sentences, the Buffalo family's Canadian operations still settled disputes the old way, with bullets rather than negotiations. Today, according to the U.S. Department of Justice, the current boss of the Buffalo crime family is Joseph A. Big Joe Todaro Jr., who assumed the role after his father, Joseph E. Lead Pipe Joe Todaro Sr. retired. The family continues to operate throughout western New York, Erie, Pennsylvania, and Hamilton, Ontario, maintaining the cross-border empire that Stefano Magaddino established more than a century ago. The organization is smaller than it once was, more careful, and less publicly visible. They don't hold meetings at remote lodges or gamble in obvious underground casinos. They operate through legitimate businesses, communicate through encrypted messages, and avoid the flashy displays of wealth that attracted attention in previous eras. But make no mistake, the Buffalo crime family still exists, and they still control criminal operations in Canadian cities, making them unique among American Mafia organizations. The story of the Buffalo crime family's control over Canadian cities is ultimately a story about the power of blood, tradition, and geography. Stefano Magaddino understood that the border between America and Canada was an artificial line that couldn't stop men who shared the same language, the same culture, and the same codes of honor that had governed Sicilian villages for centuries. He built his empire by recognizing that Ontario's Italian communities needed the same things that Buffalo's Italian communities needed: protection from outsiders, resolution of disputes that couldn't be brought to police, and opportunities to make money in ways that the legitimate economy didn't offer. The Buffalo family provided those services, and in return, they demanded loyalty, tribute, and obedience. But there's something profoundly sad about this story when you step back and see it clearly. Thousands of Italian immigrants came to Buffalo and Hamilton seeking better lives, escaping poverty in Sicily and Calabria, to work in steel mills and construction sites, to raise families and build communities in a new world. Most of them were honest, hard-working people who wanted nothing to do with criminals. Yet the Mafia that followed them from the old country imposed itself on these communities, taxing their businesses, corrupting their unions, and drawing their sons into a life that led to prison or early graves. Every dollar that Stefano Magaddino made from bootlegging came from Americans and Canadians who just wanted a drink. Every percentage point that Loan Shark S collected came from desperate men who had nowhere else to turn when their families needed money. Every union job that was controlled through intimidation and violence represented a working man who couldn't get ahead without paying tribute to criminals. The emotional truth at the heart of this empire is that it was built on the exploitation of the very communities it claimed to protect. The Buffalo crime family didn't defend Italian immigrants from prejudice and discrimination. They confirmed every negative stereotype, making it harder for honest Italian Americans to escape the assumption that they were all connected to the mob. The family's control over Hamilton didn't bring prosperity to the Italian community there. It brought violence, corruption, and the constant presence of police investigations that disrupted normal life. When Domenico Violi was promoted to underboss of the Buffalo family, becoming the first Canadian to hold that position, it wasn't a triumph for Italian Canadians or proof that they had achieved equality. It was evidence that organized crime had so thoroughly corrupted the community that a drug trafficker who poisoned his own people with fentanyl could rise to the second highest position in a criminal organization. And here's the twist that makes this story even more tragic. For all the violence, all the power, all the billions of dollars that flowed through this organization over a century, what did it ultimately accomplish? Stefano Magaddino, who built the empire, died an old man under constant surveillance. His organization fractured and his legacy tarnished. The men who followed him went to prison, became informants, or were murdered by rivals. The Violi brothers, who represented the modern face of the Buffalo family's Canadian operations, were arrested on drug charges and face spending the rest of their lives in prison. The communities they claim to serve are still poor, still struggling, still dealing with the aftermath of decades of organized crime. The border that Magaddino treated as irrelevant eventually became his enemy, as Canadian and American law. Enforcement cooperated to destroy the organization he built. The international empire that once seemed so powerful, that controlled entire cities and influenced the commission itself, has been reduced to a small, cautious organization trying to survive in an era where informants wear wires, prosecutors offer 30-year sentences, and young men would rather sell drugs independently than join a mafia family that offers only tradition and prison time. The real victims of this empire weren't the police or the prosecutors or even the rival criminals who fought with the Buffalo family over territory. The real victims were the innocent people whose lives were touched by this organization. The construction workers who had to pay protection money to keep their jobs, the store owners who were forced to buy insurance from mob-connected companies, the young men who were recruited into a life that would destroy them, and the families who buried sons and fathers and brothers who died in mob wars or from drug overdoses caused by the fentanyl that men like the Violi brothers trafficked. Every person who worked an honest job in Buffalo or Hamilton and saw criminals prosper while they struggled was a victim. Every child who grew up in neighborhoods where mob social clubs operated openly, where everyone knew who the made men were, but nobody could stop them, was robbed of the security that should have been their birthright. The Mafia empire that controlled Canadian cities from Buffalo exists now mostly in wiretap transcripts, court documents, and the memories of law enforcement officers who spent decades trying to dismantle it. The social clubs are mostly closed. The once powerful bosses are dead or in prison, and the next generation has largely turned away from the tradition, seeing it as a path to certain destruction. But the damage remains, woven into the fabric of communities that will take generations to fully heal. That's the true legacy of this empire. Not the power or the money or the respect that men like Stefano Magaddino commanded, but the long shadow of corruption and violence that still darkens the streets where honest people are just trying to build better lives for their children. The border between America and Canada remains, as it always has been, just a line on a map. But for over a century, that line meant something different to the Buffalo crime family. It meant opportunity, expansion, and a unique empire that no other mafia organization could claim. It also meant that twice as many communities were harmed, twice as many lives were destroyed, and twice as many families mourned losses that should never have happened. That is the true cost of the empire that controlled Canadian cities from Buffalo, and that cost can never be fully calculated or repaid.